Hi, I'm horror author Paul Edwards. Tonight I'm watching Bear from 2010. Bear is a wilderness survival horror story. Two couples drive along a shortcut through the wilderness when their car goes off the road and they become stranded out in the middle of nowhere. As soon as they get out of the car, a large grizzly bear enters their general area, although it doesn't attack them. But one character panics at the sight of this large bear and takes a handgun out of the car and shoots every last bullet he has into this large bear. And as soon as the large bear dies, a much larger bear emerges from the trees with an expression on its face as if to say, "Hey, what did you just do to my mate?" Of course, the hothead character has used up all of the bullets, so now the characters are defenseless. They have to run back into the car and shut themselves in, where they spend most of the movie under siege as the much larger grizzly bear first tries to break into the car to get them, and then when that doesn't work, prowls the area around the car. And this setup really writes itself. You can tell exactly which direction this story should and does take. Of course, the bear wanders out of sight, and the characters think, well, maybe he's gone now. And one of the characters will creak open the door and step foot outside, maybe even get as far as popping the hood. But then you know that the bear is going to come charging back out of the forest, and the characters will have to scramble to get back into the car again. It's a very good premise for a horror story. The setup is quite good. The protagonists are isolated. They're under siege in a confined area in this vehicle. The threat is clear. And as I say, it's a good premise for a horror story. That's not quite the same as being enough to fill a complete movie. In order to pad this story out into a feature-length movie, they had to give us a lot of the interpersonal dynamics among these four characters. And that does slow the movie down a little. Nobody is watching a movie like this to see the drama between, these individuals. We're watching for the next bear attack. But there are plenty of bear scares. Now, one thing really stood out to me in this movie because I wrote something very similar in one of my books. One of these characters is a marathon runner. And at one point, he decides he's going to make a break for it, and he's going to run through the forest until he gets to civilization and, get some help. Well, in my book, Mourners Tour, I had a character who is a marathon runner and does make a break for it and is running through the wilderness for help. And she soon discovers that marathon running has not prepared her well for running through the wilderness for her life for a couple of different reasons. First of all, of course, she's not on pavement. She's in the wilderness on rocky terrain. And secondly, she's not wearing running shoes. She's wearing hiking boots because, that's how she dressed to come out into the wilderness. So she realizes that she cannot perform athletically the same way that she's trained for. And she has to make some choices. Does she run as fast as she possibly can, knowing that she's going to tire out much sooner than she ordinarily would? Or does she decide to bank on going the distance, even though in order to do that, she knows she's going to have to slow way down? When I saw in this film the marathon runner running through the wilderness and discovering that running in the wilderness is nothing like what he has trained for, of course, I thought of my own story. So I'll give them points for that. As I say, this is really a very good setup for a horror story. They didn't really land the ending here. This is a common problem in horror, especially horror movies, I think, that a writer will come up with a good idea for a premise, and most of the story, the bulk of the story will be pretty good. But the ending seems to be lackluster because they really couldn't think of a good way to end this story. I personally write all of my books from the ending backward. The first thing I think of in a new project is how the story is going to end, what the big finish is going to be. And then I work backwards from that in constructing the story that gets us to that big finish. So endings are one of my specialties. But Bear is a pretty good nature survival horror story. There's enough scares in it to satisfy horror fans, but the adventure survival aspect of it is pretty good too. And I have learned it from watching other movies about bear attacks, like The Edge, that a lot of times they have these trained bears when they're making these films. The bears think that they're playing with the actors. So although it looks terrifying on screen, and this is a real bear, this is not a CGI bear. They used a real, very large bear for this. I'm sure that the bear in real life thought it was playing with the actors, but they did a good job of presenting it on screen as being completely terrifying. If you're a fan of vintage horror and classic monsters, and especially wilderness horror, check out my book series, the Mourners Woods books. I've written a series of stories all set in a haunted forest. My name again is Paul Edwards. My books are the Mourners Woods books. Thanks for letting me talk to you about Bear. I'll see you in Mourners Woods.